We were slowly making our way along a narrow country road, leaving behind small towns and villages. There were about 20 people in the bus cabin, tourists, full of expectations to see something truly special. As for me, as a blogger, I often travel to such places where few dare to venture. Last week, while looking for my next destination, I stumbled upon an advertisement on one of the websites. It talked about a tour to an ancient city hidden deep in the country among rocky mountains. The photos of these places looked so mesmerizing that I couldn't resist and booked a ticket, which, to my surprise, turned out to be quite affordable. Departure from my city required 2 days of travel, so we spent the first night in a hotel. I kept detailed notes for my blog throughout the journey. Along the way, I managed to get acquainted with several fellow travelers. Among them were Frank and Sarah, a lovely elderly couple with whom it was pleasant to converse, unlike my seat neighbor. He was reserved and taciturn. Even attempting to start a conversation seemed like a risky endeavor. Later, I learned his name, Victor. He was dressed entirely in black trousers, t-shirt, vest, and a hat on his head. And although his appearance could fit the description of a goth, he apparently just preferred the color black. On the second day of our journey, we continued our path through fields and forests. I occasionally made notes while a joyful and lively atmosphere prevailed in the bus. We were eagerly anticipating the moment when we would finally reach our destination. But suddenly, the bus stopped. Puzzled, we looked out the windows, but all we saw was the surrounding forest. "Hey, what's going on? Where have you brought us?" The excitement grew among the passengers. Our conductor, a middle-aged woman, calmly reassured us, explaining that the city was located amidst mountains and there was no road leading directly to it. We would have to walk the upcoming stretch of the journey through picturesque trails. She also assured us of our safety. As soon as we left the bus, we were greeted by two people, a man and a woman, both around 40 years old, dressed as if straight out of the 19th century history books. He in an elegant long coat with an impressive collar and a top hat, emphasizing his status, and she in an exquisite dress with a refined corset and a voluminous skirt adorned with bead and ribbon patterns. Introducing themselves as Archibald and Mary Ann, their names sounded as authentic as their appearance, and I gazed at them in awe. Had they just returned from a costume party? After gathering our belongings, our newfound guides invited us to follow them. Seizing the moment, I turned on the camera and began documenting our journey, commenting on each stage. The route turned out to be quite rich and took quite some time. Initially, our path led through dense forest, where old trees formed a canopy over our heads. The wide trail wound among the trees, and we tried not to lag behind each other to avoid getting lost. Emerging from the forest thicket, we came to a spacious clearing where we were greeted by warm sunlight and a gentle breeze, filling the air with the scent of wildflowers and grass. We took a short break to enjoy the surrounding beauty. Next, our path led us to swamps, where the ground became less stable and the paths became more treacherous. But even here, amidst the watery expanse and the greenery of the marsh grass, there was its own charm. Soon our path again delved into the forest, where a noticeable ascent began towards the mountain. The breath of my companions quickened, and they began to slow down, trying to cope with fatigue. Unlike them, thanks to my experience and professional training, I easily overcame these obstacles. As we progressed along the trail, the surrounding atmosphere became increasingly gloomy, casting a shadow on the group's mood. Conversations died down, and everyone walked, lost in their thoughts, awaiting the end of the journey. But suddenly, our silence was shattered by admiring and astonished exclamations. From behind the last bend of the trail, Before us appeared a sight deserving of all praise. Against the backdrop of high mountain peaks, like an impregnable fortress of time, rose a Gothic city. Its ancient features stood out against the natural landscape, creating the sensation that time had frozen here. I stood still, stunned by this beauty. Our 2-hour hike to this place was not in vain. Our enthusiasm was interrupted by the guides, reminding us of the need to continue our journey. Soon we found ourselves on a dirt road passing by fields golden with corn and various vegetables, as well as past farms where animals grazed. I continued filming, noticing people working in the fields. Their clothing was simple and reminiscent of an ancient cut. This detail made me wonder if this city was inhabited by the Amish. Well, it's quite possible, I thought. Passing by, I noticed that the workers looked up and watched us with a grim and doomed expression on their faces. No one else in the group, engrossed in cheerful conversations and discussions of what we had just seen, noticed this, except for Victor, who, as before, walked silently, standing out in his solitude among the bustling crowd. After the fields and farms were left behind, our path led to large wooden gates which were wide open at that moment. We crossed them, and before us appeared a view that seemed to transport us back to the Gothic and medieval era. Cobbled streets wound among ancient stone buildings with sharp architectural forms typical of the Gothic style. Tall windows with pointed tops, decorated with stained glass, let soft light into the rooms. People in simple attire of ancient style bustled about the streets. They went about their daily business, exchanging news or hurrying on personal errands, occasionally pausing to exchange a few words with acquaintances. Our arrival did not go unnoticed by the local residents. Casting a quick glance at us, they continued their daily activities without further ado. It seemed they didn't want to engage with us. Following our guides, we headed to an ancient establishment that in past times would have been called a tavern. Opening the door, we entered a room filled with wooden tables and a bar counter, behind which stood a bartender busy cleaning mugs. Some patrons glanced at us, meeting our gazes before returning to their conversations. All of this created the feeling of immersing into a historical film or game dedicated to the Middle Ages. The impression was truly stunning. Marianne, our guide, suggested we take seats and approach the bartender to place an order. We settled in comfortably, admiring the antique interior. About 10 minutes later, our food was served. It was a simple porridge with meat and mushrooms, accompanied by a drink resembling compote. Some in the group, feeling dissatisfied, declined the food, but I decided to try it, and it turned out to be quite good. After we finished our meal, we left the tavern and continued our tour of the city. Our footsteps echoed through the cobblestone streets, leading through the labyrinth of ancient buildings. The air was filled with the scents of local shops selling fresh vegetables, herbs, and homemade goods. Curved metal signs depicting symbols of craftsmen and merchants creaked in the wind, inviting to peek inside workshops and shops. We passed by stone houses with high-pointed roofs adorned with elegant stained glass, which caught and refracted the sunlight. Children dressed in clothes that in the modern world could only be seen at a historical reenactment or in a museum played on the narrow streets. Their laughter and shouts filled the air, making the past palpable. The journey through the city culminated at its very heart, the central square, where a huge castle towered. Its massive walls and towers dominated the cityscape. The castle was surrounded by a wide terrace with stone balustrades, from which there was a breathtaking view of the entire city and the surrounding mountains. As we passed by the majestic castle and absorbed the beauty of its architecture, my gaze unexpectedly rose to the balcony. There, standing as if immune to time and reality, was a girl of unparalleled beauty. Her hair, black as a moonless night, cascaded down her shoulders, and she wore an elaborate black dress adorned with intricate lace. She surveyed the surroundings with a melancholic gaze, and it seemed as if some goddess looked upon the mortal world from above. This scene deeply impressed me, leaving an indelible mark on my memory. Next to the palace rose a huge cathedral with magnificent stained glass windows, which we also explored, taking photographs. I continued filming for my blog, striving to capture every moment of this unique journey. Soon we left the square and headed towards the outskirts of the city, returning to the same tavern where we had stopped earlier. Looking around, I suddenly realized that Victor had disappeared. Mentioning this to the others, I understood that no one had noticed the moment of his departure. Everyone began to worry about him, but our guides assured us that they would take the investigation upon themselves and urged us not to worry. They invited us into the tavern, where we entered just as dusk was beginning to fall. The room turned out to be empty, which seemed strange. Suddenly a loud bell rang out, echoing throughout the city. Puzzled, we began to look around for explanations, but Archibald reassured us, stating that it was a common occurrence every evening, and promised that our food would be served soon. With these words, he and Marianne left the tavern. Where they were going was unknown to us. Their departure seemed suspicious to me, and I decided to follow them out onto the street. There, I witnessed a multitude of people rushing towards the city center. I approached one of the passers-by in astonishment and asked where all these people were going. The man, startled by my question, cast a glance filled with alarm at me and quickened his pace without answering. His reaction only fueled my curiosity. Returning to the tavern, I met Frank and Sarah, who asked me with bewilderment about what was happening. I confess that I myself did not fully understand the situation. While people continued to swiftly pass us by, their cautious and seemingly sympathetic glances left behind a feeling of unease. Upon returning to the tavern, I discovered that the food still had not been served. It seemed we had simply been forgotten. The situation became increasingly mysterious. The kitchen was empty, as were the other rooms we checked in search of anyone. Stepping outside, we were surprised to find that the street was also deserted. Approaching a neighboring house, I confirmed that the door was locked. The same scene played out with other houses. They were all closed. Confusion and anxiety gripped us even more. We gathered together to discuss our next strategy. Various suggestions were made among us. Some insisted on searching for the local residents, while others preferred to stay safe in the tavern. Night was falling, and I had a strong sense that we needed to find shelter. While we were having these discussions, night fell imperceptibly. The city's streetlights remained off, and the darkness engulfed the windows of the houses. The darkness was only dispelled by the full moon, whose silvery light illuminated everything around. Suddenly, our conversation was interrupted by a strange noise, resembling the rustle of wings, accompanied by uncomfortable squeaking or screeching. We looked around bewildered, trying to determine the source of the sound. Then Frank pointed upwards, and as we raised our heads, we noticed approaching dots in the sky. At first glance, they appeared to be bats, their silhouettes drawn against the moonlight. This sight left us frozen in amazement. But as the figures drew closer, it became evident that they were not just bats. My thoughts were jumbled. Is this some kind of performance? But they were getting closer, and I could see them better. They were monsters resembling humans with no clothing and leathery wings sprouting from their backs. I couldn't see their faces as it was dark. They looked dangerous and frightening, and I realized we needed to find shelter. "Run to the tavern!" I yelled, trying to spur everyone into action. The ensuing panic caused us to jostle and hurry, each striving to take cover inside. In the chaos, someone fell, others screamed in fear, but eventually, we managed to burst into the tavern and slam the door behind us. Deep darkness filled the tavern. I realized that there was apparently no electricity in this city, and no one had bothered with candles. When the last of us rushed inside, I bolted the door. People hid wherever they could. I sat next to Frank and Sarah, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone wore frightened and concerned faces. What were those creatures? Gargoyles? Vampires? Maybe it's some kind of show for guests, I thought. But the creatures seemed too real and terrifying to believe such a thing. I peeked out from my hiding spot, trying to make out the silhouettes outside the window. The windows were small, and one of our companions, a young man in his mid-20s, decided to approach one of them to see what was happening. Others shouted at him, "Come back, what are you doing?" But he bravely approached and looked out the window. Suddenly, the face of one of the creatures appeared in the window. The guy screamed and jumped back, after which a series of events followed. The door flew off its hinges with force, and 3 of these creatures burst into the room. They surveyed the room with a terrifying grin. Finally, I could see their faces. They were the most horrifying things I had ever seen in my life. Their faces resembled something between bats and monkeys. They were very repulsive and frightening. We froze in shock, not daring to move, as each of the creatures instantly leapt into action with such speed that my eyes couldn't catch their movements. They targeted 3 nearest victims, seizing them by the throat and plunging their long fangs into their necks. "They are vampires after all," echoed in my head as I experienced wild terror. A horrifying scream rang out, causing my heart to nearly stop. It was one of the victims, apparently feeling excruciating pain. The other victims also screamed horribly. This scene literally paralyzed us, and before our eyes, the vampires drained the blood of the 3 people, who literally turned into mummies in a matter of seconds. When they finished their business and discarded the bodies, they looked at us and started moving in our direction. Panic ensued. Everyone started running and scattering in different directions, but these creatures were too fast, not allowing anyone to escape. To my surprise, they didn't kill anyone. They simply grabbed people by the hands and then let go. I couldn't see what they were doing. I just ran, heading towards the kitchen, trying to hide there. Feeling like one of these creatures was chasing me, at the last moment I was grabbed from behind and thrown backward. Falling on my back, I saw the face of this creature, which was very close to me. It emitted a foul odor, and steam came out of its flat nostrils. It grabbed me by the wrist joint. I felt a sharp, burning pain, but I didn't lose consciousness. After that, the creature released me, and I fell to the floor. Lying on the floor, I raised my hand and looked at it. There was a mark, a tattoo in the form of a rose. It was beautiful, yet frightening. My hand still stung, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. Looking around, I noticed that these creatures had caught almost everyone present. Eventually, they grabbed 3 people, but unlike the others, they didn't let them go. People struggled, trying to break free, but it was futile. Impossible to resist such superhuman strength. Dragging these unfortunate souls behind them, the creatures rushed out of the tavern. I ran after them onto the street and saw them flying towards the city center, carrying people who struggled in the air. The sight was truly terrifying. The creatures themselves flew unevenly, sometimes soaring upwards, sometimes descending downwards like bats. Gradually, other survivors began to appear on the street. Some were crying, some were in shock, and some simply trembled, staring blankly at the ground. This was not a performance. We were truly in the midst of a nightmare, Of the 20 people in our group, 7 were missing. A decision needed to be made about our next actions. Frank, who had been bowed down with grief, came up to me and asked what we were going to do next. I didn't know whether we should stay or leave. Then I noticed that several people were heading towards the gate, apparently wanting to leave this place. The rest of us followed suit. Although it was dark, we tried to move as quickly as possible. Soon we reached the gate, which turned out to be locked. We started examining the opening mechanism and soon found a lever near the gate. Pulling it, we heard the sounds of gears and mechanisms, and to our surprise, the gate swung open by itself. Without hesitation, we rushed outside. Soon, in the darkness under the moonlight, the outlines of the fields and farms we already knew began to emerge. We looked around, fearing an attack from the darkness. After a while, the road ended, and the path we had come by began. Suddenly, a man in his 40s who was walking ahead screamed and grabbed his hand. We ran up to him, trying to understand what had happened. As I approached him, I felt such a strong, burning sensation in my hand that it was unbearable. Looking at my hand, I saw the mark left by those creatures, which began to glow red. I took a step back and returned to the road, where the burning gradually subsided. I thought that these creatures had marked us so that we couldn't leave. This thought filled me with horror. One of the men who had previously sat with a vacant gaze began to panic and choke. We tried to calm him down, but it didn't help. He started shouting, "I can't! This must be a dream! I just need to wake up! Maybe if I run fast!" We tried to stop him, but he broke free and ran towards the path. Despite the visible pain from the burning, he kept running until he burst into flames and burned before our eyes, turning into ashes. In shock, we watched this scene, realizing that we were doomed to stay here. No one wanted to move any further. We just sat on the edge of the road, waiting for our fate. Until dawn broke. When morning came, each of us tried to warm up and collect our thoughts. We had just over half of the original number of people left. Many had died or disappeared. What happened to those taken by those creatures was too terrifying to even imagine. My camera was smashed, but that wasn't the worst of it. The question was pressing. Could we escape from here? Suddenly, in the morning mist, we saw a couple of people walking along the road, a young woman and an old man. We all stood up and tensed, waiting to see what would happen when they approached, and if we would get any answers from them. As they approached, we saw that the woman was dressed in modern clothes, while the man wore ancient attire. They approached us slowly, afraid of scaring us away. The woman spoke first. "Excuse me, are you okay? I know you're scared right now, but I'll try to explain what's going on." But none of us responded. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Emily, and the man next to me is Rob. Like you, I ended up here and managed to survive. This city was initially conceived as a trap for people. In fact, even if you didn't have the marks, you still wouldn't be able to escape from here alive. Because the surrounding areas are patrolled by servants. Her words were interrupted by a burly man named John, who asked in a rough voice what these creatures were and what this place was. Emily replied, "As I've already told you, this place is a trap. Those creatures you saw yesterday, we call them gargoyles. But in reality, they're vampires. Yes, vampires exist. This is not a dream or fiction. They have been living in the city for centuries, luring their victims here and feeding on them. This place is like a farm for them. Imagine you keep livestock nearby, tied up on a chain. The people living here are akin to them." We all stood in shock, digesting this news as if it were ripped from some fantastical novel. Then I asked a question. If you knew we would be attacked, why didn't you warn us? And where were all those people rushing to last night?" Emily didn't immediately respond, apparently trying to formulate her answer. "You see, I'm very sorry that so many people died, but I couldn't warn you because it means I would die myself. Every last Sunday of the month, the harvest takes place. Those creatures come out and begin to hunt. We all hide in the church on that day, which you might have seen in the city center. It's the only chance to survive, as they can't reach there. Why didn't I warn you? It's because of your escorts. They're not human. I don't know what those creatures are, but they don't age or change. The oldest residents of this city say they've been the same since before. The problem is they can move during the day, unlike those creatures that only appear at night. They're incredibly strong and invulnerable. I've heard that many have tried to fight them, but they always lose. I would say they're some sort of overseers. If you don't obey the rules, they'll detain you and prevent you from entering the church. Then you'll become food for the vampires. That's why nobody messes with them, and I advise you not to get too close to them either." With these words, I asked another question. "What if it turns out that you can't bring in new victims to the city? What will happen then?" She replied, "Then they'll search for victims among the townsfolk. This couple will choose them, so they're feared just like the gargoyles." Then I remembered that man I asked where everyone was headed, who didn't answer me but ran away frightened. Apparently, if we didn't become food, they would. So they don't interfere. It was beneficial for them to have more people coming here as it affects their safety. Emily continued, "In fact, it's a friendly community here and people are united, although they don't help potential victims. But if you get the mark, you become part of the city. So let's help you settle in here and find you a job." Then a man named John couldn't hold back and shouted, "What the hell? Are you saying we're going to stay here to live? Haven't you tried to fight these creatures? How could you agree to just be food?" Emily replied, "Of course, nobody wants to become a victim, but that doesn't mean we should give up. Believe me, the people living here try to fight to find a way, but for now, they can't do anything. So maybe one of you will find a way out of this situation. In the meantime, we have to keep living to find a chance to defeat them." Then I asked, "What percentage of the locals are newcomers? And who are the natives?" Rob, who came with her, answered, "In general, 70% of the local residents are natives. The rest are newcomers." John said with anger, "So people have been living here for centuries but can't find a way out. How many generations have passed and you claim we can fight?" Emily replied, "We have no other choice. So you can do whatever you want. The rest of you can come with me. I'll help you settle in." No one objected, not even John, and everyone silently followed Emily. First, we went to the farm where they asked us who knew how to work on a farm. 5 people, including Frank and Sarah, answered affirmatively. They decided to stay there and work. The rest of us continued our journey into the city, where each of us was given a job and a place to stay. I was appointed as Rob's assistant, who took me to his home. It was not far from the main gate where we came from. We walked along the street filled with local residents who looked at us with surprise. It wouldn't be fair to say they were happy, but there was a certain sympathy in their eyes. As we passed by, they all greeted Rob, asked how he was, or asked him to come in and help with something. Soon we turned into a small alley, and after walking along it for a bit, stopped at the door of a small but neat and well-kept house. Rob inserted the key, opened the door, and invited me inside. Then he showed me around the house. It was a modest dwelling without any particular elegance, but with all the necessary amenities. There was a small kitchen and a living room. The bedrooms were upstairs. Rob led me there and opened one of the rooms. When I entered, I saw a bed and a small bedside table. As I understood, Rob lived alone in this house. Now I became his new neighbor. When I unpacked my things, Rob said to me, "Make yourself at home. On the first day, we don't let newcomers work. We give them a rest and time to gather their thoughts. Ahead of you lies a tough life, friend. But the main thing is not to give up. Tomorrow morning, I'll wake you up and we'll start working. And for now, you can do whatever you want, for example. Go explore the city, that's what I would do." I thanked him, after which he left, and I lay down on the bed, remembering the events of the past day. It was truly a nightmarish experience. I remembered the screams we heard when those people were killed, their faces, the faces of those creatures. It all felt like a nightmare. I needed to gather my thoughts and figure out how to escape from here. But soon, sleep overtook me, most likely because I hadn't slept all night. In the morning, I was woken up by Rob. It turned out that I had slept for almost a day, which had never happened to me before. Getting up, I felt a bit groggy, but at the same time refreshed. I went downstairs and washed up in the makeshift sink, after which Rob prepared breakfast and we ate together. After finishing, Rob grabbed a bag of tools and we headed outside. I asked him what we would be doing, to which he replied, "My job is to fix broken things, so I'm like a handyman who does whatever needs to be done. For example, if someone needs a door or a cupboard fixed, or if someone has plumbing issues, they usually call me." Then I asked about money, or how we would be paid here. He replied, "There are about 3,000 people living here, but we don't use money. As you can see, it's hard to produce things here as the area is limited by the city, which is located in the mountains, and the nearby territories used as fields. So there's not much room to expand here, and we try to conserve all production items. We have a strong community here, so everyone tries to do their job. The products from the fields are brought to a warehouse, where they are distributed, and everyone can come and take what they need. Of course, everyone should take only as much as they can eat, and no more. We have an elder and his assistants who oversee order, who takes what and who does what. Perhaps you'll meet them in the future." I nodded, acquainting myself with this new reality. After walking 2 streets, we arrived at a small house with a neat courtyard where a couple of chickens were grazing. Rob approached the porch and knocked on the door. A minute later, an old woman opened it, who was glad to see us and said she had been waiting for us for a long time to fix her old chest of drawers. We entered the house, which was very cozy, and headed to the bedroom. The problem was with the hinge of the door, from which one of the nails had come off. Rob took out his tools and started repairing. Meanwhile, I looked around and found an interesting wooden plaque in the chest of drawers, on which there was a strange symbol. A circle with a triangle in the center, inside of which was a cube. This symbol caught my attention, and I asked the old woman about its meaning. She replied that she didn't know, as the plaque had been passed down to her. Surprised by this information, I asked her how long she had been living here. She said she had lived here all her life, just like her ancestors, which meant she was a native resident. This symbol seemed like a clue to me. I asked Rob what he thought about it, but he evaded the answer, saying he would tell me about it later. After fixing the door, Rob asked if the old woman needed any more help, but she replied that everything was fine, and she didn't want to bother us anymore. After thanking us, we left and headed towards the city center. I saw the magnificent palace again, on the balcony of which stood the same girl in black. Asking Rob who she was, I got the answer that he didn't know, but she was definitely some kind of evil. It turned out that those gargoyles lived inside it, therefore she might be associated with them. I continued to stare at her as if enchanted, though it was hard to see her from a distance. I understood that she was very beautiful. Rob woke me from my contemplation, placing his hand on my shoulder. I startled, as if waking up from a dream, and we continued our way. So 3 weeks passed. I helped Rob and gradually settled into the life of this city. In general, everything was calm except for that nightmarish dream. Otherwise, it might have seemed like an ordinary town with friendly inhabitants. Although everyone here walked around and seemed cheerful, there was still a feeling that dark clouds hung over the people. We continued to work day by day. I met different people, and on weekends I visited Frank and Sarah, who even enjoyed being on the farm. Time flew by quickly. Sometimes I remembered my bus neighbor, Victor. Where could he have disappeared to? One day, as I was walking with Rob, that same couple, Mariana and Archibald, approached us. My colleague noticeably paled. I too became wary, but these two just smiled their smiles, which after I learned who they were, seemed creepy. They asked me if I had seen Victor, but I answered negatively, after which they said I should warn them if I encounter him. If you try to hide him, there will be consequences, they added, and without saying goodbye, left. I glanced at Rob, who was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead, clearly nervous. And when they left, he breathed a sigh of relief. As I understood, this couple were indeed dreadful beings. The next harvest was just a couple of days away. We responded to a call at an old carpentry workshop. A man named Jacob worked there. Rob knocked on the door, and we entered, finding ourselves in a spacious, naturally lit workshop. The air was filled with the smell of wood and varnish. There was an amazing order around. Tools neatly hung on the walls, and jars of paints and oils lined the shelves. In the center of the room stood a large carpentry workbench, strewn with various tools and blanks. Jacob greeted us with a warm smile, inviting us further inside. He led us to the lathe, which stood by the window. Soon we realized that one of the mechanisms was worn out and needed replacement. Around the lathe were scattered blanks, which we began to move to free up more space. Suddenly, I slipped on a lying log and started to fall forward. I would have hit the wall, but instinctively I thrust my elbows forward to protect myself. But then my elbows punched a hole in the wall. It seemed like the wall was made of thin wood. My companions rushed to me, asking if I was okay. I apologized for damaging the wall and said not to worry about me. Meanwhile, Rob approached the hole in the wall, his face changing. He muttered to himself, "Is this a miracle, or is it fate?" I didn't understand what he meant and approached closer to examine the hole. Meanwhile, my colleague began to tear off more pieces of the wall. "Hey, what are you doing, buddy?" I said. But he didn't answer, just continued dismantling the wall until a large stone plaque with the familiar symbol appeared before us. A triangle with a cube in the middle. I looked at Rob, whose hands were trembling, and who couldn't take his eyes off the symbol. Then he turned and said, "Sorry, Jacob, but we'll be back next time. For now, hide this symbol with something." Then he told me to follow him. We went out onto the street and headed southwest of the town, where I had never been before. Rob hurriedly crossed one street after another, and I tried not to lag behind. Soon we found ourselves in front of a large building, went inside, and went up to the 3rd floor. Rob knocked on the door and we heard a voice telling us to come in. My neighbor hurriedly entered with the words, "Edmund, I finally found him." When I entered the office, I saw an old man with a long beard sitting at the table, holding a sheet of paper. He looked up and asked, "What did you find?" "The third sign. It was in Jacob's carpentry workshop," Rob replied. The old man, apparently named Edmund, jumped up and said excitedly, "Has it finally happened?" Then he went to the wall, pressed a button, and a secret door opened. Opening it wider, he stepped inside. Rob followed him and gestured for me to come. When I found myself inside, I saw a room filled with sheets glued with names, maps, and the same symbol. Rob and Edmund stood near a large map of the city hanging in the center of the room. They marked a point that apparently was the carpentry workshop, after which they drew a straight line from another point at the top of the map. From this point, another line led down to the left, forming a kind of triangle. They looked at it with undisguised excitement and then, using a ruler, also drew perpendiculars from the points to each side of the triangle. As a result, there was an intersection. They highlighted this place, and Edmund said, "This is an old fountain. Here it is, that place." Then they looked at each other hopefully. Suddenly, Edmund turned his gaze to me and asked, "And who is this?" "This is my colleague and neighbor, Mike," Rob said. "I see." He shook my hand and said, "I'm the elder of this town. My name is Edmund. Nice to meet you." I shook his hand and asked what was going on. After that, Rob began to explain. "Remember, you found a plaque with a mysterious sign at that old lady's house? I promised to tell you about it later. So, this is the secret we recently discovered. We found 2 more identical symbols in other parts of the city, and realized we needed to find the third one. At the intersection of their perpendiculars, we will find a place related to our marks. That is, perhaps there we will learn the solution and be able to escape from here." I was shocked and delighted by this news, as it was a chance. I said that we needed to go and explore this place immediately, but they both shook their heads and said that there were many spies here, and we needed to wait out the harvest, which would be in a few days. I also remembered this terrifying event. Understood. After which, we discussed the details and decided to delve into the mystery later. It was Sunday. Rob had left somewhere in the morning and hadn't returned yet. I was noticeably nervous, as it was the first time I experienced Harvest Day without being a victim. I knew that when the bell rang, I had to go to the cathedral, which was located in the city center. With nothing much to do, I wandered around the city, observing what people were up to. There was tension in the air. After strolling around, I returned home, had lunch, and then headed to the city center, walking around the square, admiring the sights. I saw that girl again on the balcony, looking melancholic as ever. Suddenly, she turned her head and our eyes met. I don't know why, but shivers ran down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back. She noticed this but didn't react, turning her head again and gazing into the distance. I decided to leave quickly and headed towards the cathedral. I walked around it feeling quite nervous. Why did I come here so early? Because I was afraid of being late. As it started to get dark, a loud bell rang near the cathedral, almost deafening me. I noticed people gathering around the church. Among them, I saw familiar faces of those who had come with me. However, I didn't see Sarah and Frank anywhere. Rob was also missing. I thought there was still time, and they would make it. Deciding to go inside, I found a huge cathedral capable of accommodating several thousand people. Inside, it was dimly lit, with only candles and lamps faintly illuminating the space, creating a mysterious atmosphere. Stained glass windows depicted scenes from sacred texts, playing with colors on the walls and floor. Rows of benches were filled with people praying or just sitting and waiting. The silence in the cathedral was only broken by the whisper of prayers and soft chanting coming from behind the altar. I was noticeably agitated. Rob was still nowhere to be found, and my elderly friends were also missing. I headed towards the entrance and noticed that fewer people were entering. It was getting dark outside, and the guards at the entrance were about to close the doors. I rushed to them and asked, "Wait, there are still people who haven't come." They shook their heads and said that it was time to close. I panicked for my friends, looking around for help. Then I noticed Emily, the same girl I met on the first day. I ran up to her and told her that Rob and my friends were missing. She sadly lowered her head and said, "There were no newcomers this month, so the victims were chosen from the townspeople." Her words shocked me. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, and shouted, "Why aren't you doing anything? Why didn't you tell me earlier?" She remained silent. How did it come to be that the people closest to me became victims? Their faces flashed through my mind, especially Rob's. I had grown attached to that old man, and a determination rose within me. I asked Emily where they were. She replied that the victims were usually tied up near the old gates. "So I think they're there." "The old gates?" I asked. "Is that where we came from the first time?" She nodded affirmatively. I turned and ran. The guards were already closing the doors, but I pushed them aside and rushed outside. I ran with all my might and soon reached the right place. In the distance, I saw silhouettes of people standing near a stone pedestal with iron rings used to tie the victims. They were my friends. Gasping for breath, I ran up to them. Their doomed faces turned into surprise. Rob shouted, "What are you doing, you fool? Run from here, they'll be here soon." But I shook my head and started looking for a way to free them. They were chained to a thick chain. Damn it, I should have brought tools with me. Tugging at the chain, to my horror, I heard a familiar rustle of wings, that unpleasant screech. I turned my head and saw those creatures flying in the sky. I swallowed hard and continued to pull at the chain. Carefully examining it, I noticed that it was securely fastened, meaning there must be a mechanism to open it. I began to circle the pedestal in search of it, occasionally glancing at the sky. Those creatures were getting closer. Circling the pedestal, I saw a lever at the back. They certainly loved making mechanisms in this city. I pulled it with all my strength, but it didn't give in. Suddenly, I heard noise nearby. Looking out from behind the pedestal, I saw that the creatures had already arrived. They landed with a crash and began to look around, clearly in no hurry, enjoying the moment. Meanwhile, I was trying to pull that damn lever, which stubbornly refused to move. Then one of the creatures grabbed an unfamiliar woman and forcefully tore the chain. I couldn't just stand by and watch. I dashed out from behind the pedestal, shouting, trying to distract it. The creature turned its attention to me, dropping the woman. I turned and started running. All three creatures took to the air and chased after me. I ran for my life, afraid to look back, but I could feel them catching up with me. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, tumbling over. Landing on my back, I opened my eyes and saw those creatures leaning over me, their hideous grins sending shivers down my spine. Then I thought that it was the end for me. One of the creatures reached out to me. I closed my eyes, preparing for death, but then I heard gunshots. Opening my eyes, I saw that one of the creature's heads had exploded and another's hand was blown off. The third one managed to take off into the distance. It was my chance. Jumping up, I looked around and saw a silhouette emerging from the darkness. Trying to make out who it was, I soon recognized him. It was Victor. He was quickly approaching me and said that we needed to hurry. I looked up at the sky and saw the third creature flying off into the distance. I had a million questions for him, but Victor dragged me towards the pedestal. The captives, shocked, looked at us. Our savior circled the pedestal and shouted for me to help him. Together we pulled the lever, which was very difficult, but soon we heard the sound of a mechanism. Returning to our friends, I saw that the rings had slid forward and the chains could be freed. However, they were still hanging on the people. Victor said we needed to run quickly, as that creature would likely call for reinforcements. He asked if there was a place where we could take cover. We started to think, and then Rob said that there might be one place and set off. We followed. After about 10 minutes of our journey, we reached the fountain. Victor, with doubt in his voice, addressed Rob, "Where do you plan to take shelter here?" To which Rob did not respond, but began to circumnavigate the fountain, feeling every corner of it. The fountain was turned off, and Rob, not losing hope, pulled on everything that could move in search of a hidden mechanism. Suddenly he cried out, "Help me! There must be some mechanism here." We joined in his search, although it was not clear what exactly we were looking for. From time to time, I glanced at the sky, expecting the appearance of gargoyles. We continued our futile attempts to find something when suddenly a screech sounded from the sky, causing all of us to startle. Rob commanded us to accelerate our search. Continuing to feel every inch of the fountain in the darkness, I finally found a button under the platform. Pressing it, I heard the sound of a mechanism activating. Stepping back, I saw a staircase open at the bottom of the fountain before me. We exchanged surprised glances, then Rob began to descend first. We followed him, still hearing the distant screeches of the vampires. Victor turned on a flashlight, illuminating our path along the spiral staircase leading us deeper underground. Eventually, we emerged onto a platform where we found another button. Pressing it, we heard the familiar sound of mechanisms, and the staircase returned to its original position, sealing the entrance behind us. We continued moving through the long tunnel, adorned with intricate carvings, anticipating danger from every side. After some time, we reached a cavernous chamber supported by huge pillars. In the center of this hall, we found a skeleton, next to which lay a diary. Approaching closer, we wrested the diary from the cold skeletal fingers and began to read. It turned out that the diary belonged to one of the pioneers of this city, who claimed to know how to lift the curse hanging over the city. Unfortunately, he was wounded in an attempt to free the city and bequeathed in the diary to continue his work to whoever found his message. The diary indicated to continue down the corridor, where we needed to destroy a specific cube guarded by sentries. After reading, we exchanged glances, deciding on our next steps. Victor suggested continuing the journey alone, but Rob and I insisted on going together with him. Not wanting to argue, Victor agreed. Leaving the others in the relative safety of the chamber, we set off down the corridor, going deeper. Drawings began to appear on the walls depicting vampires and humans. One of them showed a woman on a throne, surrounded by winged creatures, with people in cages around her depicted with such despair that even through the primitive outlines of the drawing, it was evident. Curiosity gripped me. Then the image of the beauty on the balcony of the palace flashed in my memory. Could it be her? Could she be the head vampire, or, as it is correctly called, an elder? As we continued our journey, I decided to ask Victor questions: who he was and how he managed to defeat these creatures. Victor hesitated for a moment, as if considering his answer or deciding whether to respond to me. Finally, he said, "You could call me a vampire hunter. I killed these creatures with silver bullets. Yes, it sounds like a cliché, but it didn't appear for no reason." After these words, he fell silent. But my curiosity was not quenched. "Still, tell me, where did you come from and how did you learn about this city?" I continued to insist. Victor replied, "I've been hunting these creatures for a long time. It's, so to speak, a family business. How did I find this city? I always follow people's disappearances, and this area seemed suspicious to me. So I started searching. And here I am. Now my task is to destroy them, and above all, to save people." After these words, I couldn't get anything else out of him. We continued in silence. Only the chain hanging on Rob rang along the way. Suddenly, our path was blocked by a dead end, in the wall of which a small opening was found, located at floor level. Through it one could crawl, lying on the ground, and the flickering red light from it foretold of something unusual beyond this passage. Victor was the first to lie down on the ground and begin to squeeze through this narrow opening. I followed suit. When I finally emerged on the other side, before me stood a magnificent hall, filled with red light emanating from stones set around its perimeter. This hall was something like an ancient temple, where every detail seemed imbued with magic and history. In the center of this majestic space, like the heart of the temple, a transparent cube floated in the air. Within its depths beat a living heart, pulsating and emitting light, coloring the walls of the hall in heavy shades of red. This sight was simultaneously breathtaking and slightly frightening, as the heart inside the cube seemed to be something alive, whose fate was closely intertwined with the secrets of this place. Approaching the cube, we were as if hypnotized by this majestic spectacle. Suddenly, Victor, taking a pistol in his hands and aiming at the heart inside the cube, declared that it needed to be destroyed. However, in the next moment he sharply turned around, pushed us aside, and himself recoiled backward. Through the air, a huge creature soared, and looking back, I saw on the ground a creature that had landed resembling a wolf. Werewolf flashed through my mind, or at least someone very much like him. The creature emitted a terrible growl. With a battle cry, Victor rushed forward. "This is the guardian of this place. It must be killed." From his holster, he pulled out a second pistol and threw it to me. Struggling to catch the weapon, I aimed it at the creature. I didn't know how to use it and hesitated until Rob guided me on how to remove the safety. Before I could do it, Victor opened fire. The creature tried to dodge, but several bullets still hit their marks. However, it didn't give up, and making a powerful leap, lunged at Victor, opening its jaws. He skillfully dodged the attack, continuing to shoot. The creature attacked again, but Victor didn't stop firing. Finally, the creature managed to knock him to the ground. Victor grabbed it by the ears, trying to prevent it from biting him. As I tried not to hit Victor, I eventually found confidence and began to shoot, emptying the magazine. The creature fell lifeless. Victor pushed it away from himself, approached me, and with reproach in his eyes said, "You hesitated for too long." Then he headed towards the cube and, without hesitation, emptied the entire magazine into its heart. The heart momentarily froze and then began to bleed, flooding the floor with blood. Soon it stopped beating, and then from somewhere above, a piercing screech rang out, causing the ground beneath our feet to tremble. We understood that it was time to run. We quickly headed for the same opening through which we had entered this hall, hurrying to escape from the underground before new threats caught up with us. As we fled down the corridor, Rob noticed that the ominous mark still hadn't disappeared, to which Victor replied that destroying the heart was only the first step. Now it was time to face the Queen. "With whom?" I asked again, not believing my ears. "That woman in black who dwells in the palace," clarified Victor. Remembering her, I felt a mixture of admiration and horror. "Do we really have to kill such a beautiful creature?" flashed through my mind. But then I pushed that feeling aside, thinking that perhaps she had enchanted me. Returning to the hall, Victor announced that our next step was to penetrate the palace. However, there was one problem. The palace was teeming with servants, or rather gargoyles, and they needed to be distracted somehow. Then Rob proposed a plan. We needed to contact the elder in the cathedral to help us. They had a supply of fireworks hidden in a warehouse to the north of the city. "If we light them up, the gargoyles are sure to flock there," said Rob. After a short pause, Victor approved the plan, adding that it would be dangerous. Rob declared that he could handle it, but first he needed to get to the church, as the keys to the warehouse were with the elder. He volunteered to go there, taking the prisoners with him. After saying goodbye to Frank and Sarah, I wished them to take care of themselves. Then Victor and I climbed up the spiral staircase. Victor used a special spray that was supposed to hide us from the vampire's sense of smell and handed me a supply of bullets from his backpack, as well as several grenades, explaining how they worked. These grenades were equipped with special shards dangerous to vampires. Doing our best to stay in the shadows and not be noticed by the gargoyles, we headed towards the palace. After about an hour of waiting and hiding, I glanced at my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Time was running out, as with the dawn, the gargoyles were supposed to return to the castle. Suddenly, explosions thundered in the distance and flashes of fireworks illuminated the sky to the north. The gargoyles reacted instantly and flew in that direction, many of them flying out of the castle. I mentally prayed for the guys to manage to get away from there. Taking advantage of the moment, we sneaked into the castle. To our surprise, the entrance door was open. Inside, we were greeted by a huge hall adorned with exquisite carvings and marble, with 2 staircases leading upstairs. Ascending to the second floor, we were met by 2 gargoyles swiftly rushing towards us. Victor, with unwavering calm, aimed and fired several shots, accurately hitting each one in the head, causing them to explode in flight. Amazed by his skill, I followed him until we reached the end of the huge hall, where 2 staircases branched off. Victor pointed me towards one of them and instructed me to ascend, warning me not to engage in a fight with the woman in black if I encountered her. Although I felt fear, I nodded in agreement and we parted ways. Ascending the staircase, I found myself in a hall with only one door. Carefully opening it, I saw inside the familiar pair of guides who had brought us to this city. They noticed me, smiled, and invited me in. Doubts battled in my mind, to flee or to confront them face to face. Deciding that I must help Victor, I entered the room, aiming my gun at them. Despite my aggression, they remained calm and Mariana offered to talk. However, I rejected her offer and fired a shot into her chest. She recoiled, then looked at the wound and glanced back at me, transforming into something horrifying, resembling a banshee. As she screamed and lunged at me, I began to shoot, noticing Archibald trying to flank me. Backing towards the door, I kept shooting until I found myself next to the exit. Then I quickly grabbed 2 grenades, tore off the pins with my teeth, and threw them at the enemy's feet. Jumping out of the room, I rolled along the hall at the moment of the explosion. Shielding my head from the shrapnel with my hands, I lay still until the dust settled. Standing up, I peeked into the room and saw that only charred remains were left of the guides. Overcoming a momentary feeling of nausea from the horrifying sight, I pulled myself together and returned to the staircase to find Victor and report what had happened. Soon I found myself facing a door again. Carefully opening it, my gaze fell upon a magnificent hall with a balcony in the center of which stood a throne. Gracefully seated upon it was the mysterious lady in black, whose beauty was so striking that it instantly captivated me. To my surprise, next to her, at her feet, sat Victor, his gaze absent as if he were under the spell of hypnosis. Realizing that I had been noticed, I dared to enter the hall. The vampire queen directed her piercing gaze at me, never once averting it. I advanced slowly, holding my weapon, ready for any outcome. She smiled at me, and I felt my hands starting to lower as if under the influence of her magnetism. Making a concerted effort of will, I shook myself to dispel the enchantment and stopped 10 paces away from her. Her smile didn't fade, and she remarked that she was impressed by our achievements. Despite the circumstances, her praise unexpectedly warmed my soul. The queen slowly rose from her throne, her gaze sweeping across the hall before returning to me. Suddenly, her face transformed, contorting into a terrifying grimace as she began to speak, raising her voice. "Immortality, darlings. It's not your dream, it's my reality. Time to me is but a pastime, your lives mere fleeting sparks. Power is my game, where I am the unquestionable victor. I am eternity, and you are transience. My world is one where I reign unyieldingly and undisputedly. Remember, every whisper, every sigh of yours is nothing but an echo of my greatness." Shocked by the abrupt change in mood in her words, I felt the tension in the air reach its peak. When she took a sudden step forward, I instinctively opened fire. To my horror, the bullets missed her, as if she gracefully dodged each one. In the next moment, I found myself losing control of my body. An invisible force lifted me into the air and began to twist my joints in unnatural directions, causing unbearable pain. A scream tore from my throat, and in the queen's eyes, I saw reflected pleasure in my suffering. It seemed like the end, but at the last moment, Victor came to the rescue, apparently breaking free from the queen's hypnotic influence. I noticed him unbuttoning his jacket, under which lay a vest filled with silver dynamite. My heart sank at the realization of his intentions. I wanted to scream to urge him to stop, but all that came from my throat was a croak. With unexpected resolve, Victor lunged forward and embraced the queen. She merely smirked, not expecting a real threat from him. But then came the explosion, hurling me to the other end of the hall filled with red light from the blast, and everything happened with incredible speed. My head spun, but my thoughts were consumed only by Victor's sacrifice. The bitterness of loss engulfed my soul, and tears involuntarily streamed down my face. Lying on the floor, I surveyed the spot where Victor and the queen had been, but now there was only emptiness. Shards of the shattered throne, dust, blood, and debris. In my heart, there was only one thought: endless gratitude and sorrow for the loss of a new friend whose sacrifice was too great. Getting to my feet, overcoming pain and limping, I headed for the exit from the castle. Along the way, I encountered no one, and finally I stepped out onto the street. My first glance was towards the sky, where the first rays of dawn began to tint the darkness with warm hues of morning light. At that moment, as I breathed in the cool air of the new day, a noise came from my left, and I saw Rob approaching, accompanied by other townspeople. Victory played on their faces, but I, aware of the price we had paid for it, couldn't fully share their joy. Rob ran up to me, lifting his shirt to reveal his wrist. The rose mark had disappeared. I looked at my own hand and with relief found that I no longer bore the sign either. Telling Rob about what had happened and Victor's sacrifice, I saw understanding and respect flash in his eyes for the fallen hero. "We will never forget him," he promised. And I knew it was true. Less than an hour later, a crowd gathered on the central square, ready to leave this place forever. The mayor announced that it was time to gather belongings and depart. I stood among the crowd, watching as people, filled with hopes for a new life, crossed the gates and headed into the unknown, illuminated by the first rays of the morning. At that moment I felt a strange calmness. Sadness for the lost friend mingled with the realization that we had done the impossible, freed ourselves from the curse, and paved the way for a new era for this town and its inhabitants. Victor's sacrifice had not been in vain, and his name would live on in the hearts and memories of everyone who today walked through these gates towards a brighter future. And as the last residents disappeared from sight, I turned one last time, looking at the castle, which now seemed less menacing in the light of the rising sun. Then I turned and followed the others, towards a new life, towards new hope, carrying in my heart the memory of the past and dreams of the future.